The wall came from the northwest. That is the only way to describe it. Not a storm, not a cloud formation. A wall, black and absolute, moving across the Dakota Plains on the afternoon of January 12th, 1888, with the particular indifference of something that does not know it is killing people and would not slow down if it did. Arvid Breckman saw it first. He was on horseback on the Ridge Road, a man of 69 years, who had learned to read this sky the way other men read scripture carefully, with the understanding that misreading it had consequences that could not be undone. He turned his horse without a word. He rode at a full gallop past the Solberg claim, and he did not stop because stopping would have cost him seconds he did not have, but he shouted as he passed, "Get inside! Get inside now!" Ingrid Solberg heard him through the cabin wall. She had been at the cook stove stirring a pot of corn porridge, and she heard the hoofbeats before she heard the words, and she knew from the sound of those hoofbeats the particular urgency of a horse being pushed past its comfortable pace by a rider who was not given to panic that something was wrong before the words reached her. She dropped the spoon. She went to the door and opened it and felt the air, which was still 40 degrees, still mild, still carrying that strange warmth that had settled over the valley for the past 3 days, the warmth that had seemed like a gift and was not a gift at all. She looked northwest. The wall was there, moving, perhaps 2 miles out, perhaps less. Not a cloud in any sense she had a word for. A solid darkness advancing across the flat land with the patience of something that has all the time it needs. Willem was at her knee, 5 years old, looking up at her the way he always looked up at her when he sensed something in her face that he did not yet have the language to ask about. She picked him up. She did not run. Running on ice is how people fall, and people who fall on days like this do not always get back up. She walked fast, deliberately back to the door and through it and into the cabin, and she pulled the door shut behind her with both hands and threw the latch. 12 seconds later, the wall hit. The sound was not wind in the way wind sounds when it moves around a building. It was pressure, a physical blow against every surface, simultaneously the sod walls shuddering, the oiled paper in the window frame going white. The temperature inside the cabin dropping 3 degrees in the first minute as cold found every gap and crack and pushed through. Ingrid stood in the center of the cabin with Willem against her chest, and she felt beneath her feet, through the soles of her boots and the pine boards of the floor, the faint warmth that rose from the ground below. Below the floor, below the trap door that sat flush with the boards near the stove, hinged with leather straps she had cut from an old bridle, covering the opening that she had spent 3 weeks making with a pick and a shovel, and hands that had bled every day of those 3 weeks and had healed and bled again. She stood on the floor she had built above the cellar she had dug, listening to the storm she had been warned about since August, and she understood that the next 3 days would tell her whether the thing she had done in defiance of every piece of advice she had been given was something that would save them. She put Willem down. She went to the stove and fed it a log from the stack beside the wall. The log was dry. That was the thing. After everything, after all of it, the log was dry. She had not known when she started whether it would be. 5 months earlier, in the last week of August 1887, Ingrid Solberg had arrived in Kingsbury County, Dakota Territory, on a wagon driven by a man who had not spoken more than 6 words to her in the 4 hours since she had paid him $2 at the depot in DeSmet. The $2 had been half her remaining money. She had started with $11. The train from Minnesota had cost her $9. She had $2 left, which became nothing when she paid the wagon driver. And then she had what she had on the wagon: a trunk of clothes, a cast iron skillet, a quilt her mother had made 30 years ago, and Willem, who sat beside her on the wagon bench, with his legs sticking straight out because the bench was too high for his feet to reach the edge, watching the grass go by with the serious attention of a 5-year-old who has been told to sit still and is doing his best. The wagon stopped. The driver jerked his chin toward a low structure in the middle of a flat field, and Ingrid had understood this was where she was getting off. She climbed down. She lifted Willem down. The driver handed her trunk to the ground without climbing off himself, and then he turned the wagon and was gone, and the sound of the wheels and the horses' hooves faded across the flat land until there was nothing left but the wind and the grass moving in it, and the particular silence of a place that has never been loud. Ingrid stood in that silence and looked at what she had come to. The soddy was 12 feet by 14. Its walls were cut blocks of prairie sod stacked 2 feet thick, already settling and cracking in places, already beginning the slow return to the earth they had been cut from. The roof was poles and brush and more sod laid over the walls sagging in the center with the weight of the last rain. A single window faced south, covered with oiled paper instead of glass, letting in a gray filtered light that made the interior look like the inside of a place where things are stored rather than lived in. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. Inside, and she made herself go inside, made herself walk through the crooked door and stand in the interior and look at it, clearly was a packed earth floor, a rusted cook stove missing one leg and propped up on a flat stone in a bed frame with no mattress. That was everything. This had been her Uncle Peter's claim. He had filed on it in 1882, had lived here through 5 Dakota winters, had written letters to Minnesota describing the land and the sky and the possibility of things. His last letter had arrived in March. The news of his death had arrived in May. Typhoid, same as the fever that had taken Ingrid's daughter the winter before. Same as the fever that had taken her daughter's husband the winter before that. Ingrid was 64 years old. Her husband Gunnar had been gone 5 years quietly in his sleep, the way good men sometimes go when their work is done. She had sold the house in Minnesota. She had enough for the train and the wagon, and $2 left over and a piece of paper from the land office that said she was now the head of a household claimant on 60 acres of grass and sky and the soddy that her uncle had left behind. She had 14 weeks until winter. She did not know yet what that meant. Willem stood in the doorway behind her, looking at the inside of the soddy. "Is this ours?" he asked. "It is," she said. He thought about this. "It smells like dirt." "It's made of dirt," she said. "We'll get used to it." She was not sure this was true, but it was the kind of thing that needed to be said. Arvid Breckman came on the third day. He walked across the prairie from the east in the early morning, moving at the deliberate pace of a man who is in no hurry because he has already decided what he is going to see before he gets there. He was 69 years old, gray-bearded, deep-lined around the eyes with 2 fingers missing from his left hand, lost to frostbite in his second Dakota winter. He had homesteaded his claim in 1876 when the land had been newer and harder than it was now, and he had survived 11 winters here. He had helped bury 4 neighbors who had not. He stood outside the soddy and waited. Ingrid came out. She had been trying to level the cook stove, wedging flat stones under the propped corner, trying to make the surface even enough to cook on without everything sliding to one side. She came out with her hands dirty and her back aching from the angle she'd been working at. Arvid looked at her the way he looked at the soddy, assessing, methodical, doing the calculation that his experience made automatic. "You're Peter's niece," he said. "Not a question." "I am." "Typhoid." "Yes." He walked a slow circuit of the soddy. He looked at the saw walls. He looked at the roof. He looked at the empty ground where a barn should be, where a woodshed should be, where a root cellar should be. He completed the circuit and stood in front of her again. "You filed on the claim 3 days after he died, head of household." She nodded toward the doorway where Willem had appeared, watching with the solemn attention of a child who understands that something important is happening, even when he cannot follow the words. "I'm responsible for him." Arvid looked at the boy, looked back at her. "Money, Mom." $9. A pause. "What Peter left." "Tools. An axe. A saw with 3 teeth missing. A shovel. Stock, bone. Nothing. Wood. Nothing." She watched his face as he processed this, watched him do the arithmetic she had not yet fully done herself, the arithmetic that would keep her awake for the next 4 months. 6 cords, he said, minimum. A cabin this size with a stove in that condition, you need 6 cords of wood to make it through winter, more if it runs long. 81 ran from October to May, 35 blizzards. The railroad was shut 4 months. How long is a typical winter? November through March, sometimes April, sometimes October if God is feeling mean. Ingrid did the calculation in her head. 6 cords. A cord was 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet, 128 cubic feet of wood. 6 of them, nearly 800 cubic feet, all of it needing to be cut and split and hauled from Redstone Creek 8 miles away. "I can cut 6 cords," she said. Arvid shook his head, not arguing, simply denying the existence of the thing she had just said. You've never swung an axe in your life, I can tell by your hands. He said it without cruelty, the way a doctor states a diagnosis. Cutting 6 cords takes an experienced man 8 weeks of hard labor. You've got to haul it 8 miles on top of that. No horse, no wagon. He looked at the ground beside the soddy. And that's only getting the wood here. Where are you going to put it? She said nothing. Wood left outside gets wet. Rain and fall snow in winter. Wet wood burns half as hot as dry wood. You'd need twice as much fuel to get half the heat. Wet wood fills your stovepipe with creosote. Creosote catches fire. I have watched 4 soddies burn from chimney fires in the last 3 years. He looked at Willem in the doorway. When he spoke again, his voice was flat, not cruel, but carrying the particular weight of a man who has seen what he is describing. A woman alone with a child cannot cut 6 cords and keep them dry. You'll burn green wood. The smoke will choke that boy. And by February, they'll dig you both out of a snowdrift. The wind moved across the grass between them. What would you have me do? Ingrid said. Sell the claim. Take whatever you can get. Go back to Minnesota before the snow traps you. And do what in Minnesota I have nothing there. No family, no money, no house but us. Arvid shrugged. He had said what he had come to say. He turned and began walking back across the prairie toward his own claim, 3/4 of a mile east. I'll send my daughter with milk when we have extra, he called over his shoulder. Won't be enough to keep you alive. Might keep the boy healthy a few extra weeks. Then he was gone. Ingrid stood in the prairie morning and looked at the place where he had disappeared over the low rise, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of something that was adjacent to despair, but was not despair because despair is a thing that stops a person, and she did not stop. She went back inside and finished leveling the cook stove. The first 3 weeks, she did what everyone expected. She borrowed a horse from Arvid. The price was labor 3 days helping with his harvest, which she gave without complaint, working beside his daughter in the oat field until her shoulder screamed. Then she made trips to Redstone Creek. 8 miles each way, 16 miles of walking beside the borrowed horse, guiding it through the grass that was already browning at the tips, dragging cottonwood logs back to the claim. Cottonwood, the worst firewood on the plains. It burned fast and hot and then was gone, throwing less sustained heat than oak or ash. But cottonwood was what grew along Redstone Creek, so cottonwood was what she would burn. Each trip took a full day. Leave before first light, reach the creek by mid-morning, spend 2 hours cutting and trimming, start back. Arrive at the claim after dark if the horse cooperated, if the logs did not catch on every rock and rut. Each trip brought back perhaps 1/3 of a cord. By the end of September, she had 3 cords stacked outside the soddy covered with brush and canvas scraps that would not keep out serious rain and certainly would not keep out snow. 3 cords, half of what she needed. Then the horse went lame. Arvid came himself to collect it. He stood in the yard looking at the woodpile while his eldest son led the limping animal away. 3 cords. He looked at the stack and then at her. You're short, he said. I know. Without the horse, you can't haul enough, not in time. With a hand cart, you'll get maybe a 1/4 cord per trip. You need 12 more trips for the other 3 cords. 12 full days. The trails will be snow-covered before you finish. I know. He waited. She understood he was waiting for something, for her to acknowledge that he had been right, or to ask for help, or to show some sign that she was ready to accept the conclusion his arithmetic had already reached. She showed him none of these things. He left. That night, after Willem was asleep on the blankets she had made into a bed on the floor near the stove, Ingrid pulled on her coat and walked through the dark to her Uncle Peter's old claim. The new owner would not arrive until spring, according to the land office. The soddy stood empty, the half-collapsed barn beside it open to the sky, the root cellar at the edge of the yard sealed with a wooden door set into the sloping earth. She opened the door. She was looking for anything useful, carrots, potatoes, anything Petter might have left behind. The cellar was empty. He had eaten or given away everything before he got sick. But the cellar was not cold. She stood inside it and understood this was wrong. Outside, the September night had dropped to perhaps 40 degrees. Inside the cellar, 6 feet underground, the air was different. She could feel it on her face, on her bare hands. Warmer. Not warm in the way a heated room is warm, but warm in the way that comes from something deeper than weather. 50 degrees, perhaps. 55. A steady, maintained temperature that had nothing to do with whether the sun was shining or the wind was blowing. She remembered something her father had told her when she was a girl in Minnesota, something about chemis, and about how the earth held its temperature below the frost line, how it stayed at the same degree year-round once you got far enough down. Root cellars worked in summer because they stayed cool. She had never thought about the other side of that equation, about what they did in winter. The walls were damp. Moisture beaded on the wooden support posts. That was how root cellars were supposed to be. The dampness kept vegetables from drying out and shriveling. But near the vent pipe, the short length of stovepipe, set into the earth wall near the ceiling, angled upward and out, the wood was different. She reached out and touched it. Dry. Bone dry, in a room that was otherwise damp from every surface. The air moving through the vent had pulled the moisture out of the wood near it, had carried it up and out, leaving behind timber that was as dry as anything she might have stored in a proper woodshed. She stood in that empty cellar for a long time. Her father had said something else, something about warm air and moisture, about how warm air holds more moisture than a cold air, about how when warm air contacts a cold surface, it releases that moisture. But when it is allowed to move and circulate, it carries the moisture with it and takes it away. She was not a scientist. She had not studied these things. She was a 64-year-old widow from Minnesota who had kept a house and raised a daughter and buried a husband and was now standing in her dead uncle's root cellar at 10 o'clock at night, trying to understand something she could feel but could not yet put into words. The wood near the vent was dry. The moving air had done that. She walked back to the soddy in the dark, not seeing the prairie grass around her, not seeing the stars above, seeing instead the floor of her cabin, the puncheon floor, split logs set flat side up directly on the packed earth, not nailed, not fastened, just set in place and left to settle. She could lift them. She had never needed to lift them before, but there was nothing holding them down, and they could be lifted, and beneath them was earth. Earth she could dig. She lay awake until well past midnight, listening to Willem's breathing and the wind outside, thinking about the root cellar and the dry wood and the moving air and the floor that could be lifted, thinking about what it would cost in time to dig and what it would cost in time to not dig, and whether a thing that had never been tried was the same as a thing that could not work. It was not the same thing, not the same thing at all. She started in the morning. She moved the cook stove to the side of the room. She pried up the puncheon logs one by one and stacked them against the wall. The earth beneath was hard-packed clay and less the kind of soil that had been compressed by years of Dakota weather into something that required a pick rather than a shovel to break the surface. She had her uncle's pick. She marked a rectangle in the center of the floor, 6 feet by 8 feet, positioned so that it would sit directly below where the stove would stand when she moved it back. Then she swung the pick. The earth cracked. A small crack a few inches. She swung again. Another crack. The work was not dramatic. It was simply the repetition of a motion over and over, breaking loose chunks of clay that she shoveled into a bucket and carried to the door and dumped outside where the pile grew slowly, one bucket at a time. Willem watched from the corner. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Digging a hole." "Why?" She did not have an answer he would understand. She was not sure she fully understood it herself. She only knew that she could not do what Arvid said, and she could not do nothing. And somewhere between those two impossibilities, there was a third thing, a thing she had thought of in the dark in her dead uncle's root cellar, and she was going to find out if it was real. "Hand me that bucket when I fill this one," she said. He did. Sigrid Voss came on the third day of digging. She was 57 years old, a widow who had farmed a claim a quarter-mile south for 3 years, who had come through 3 Dakota winters alone after her husband died in the second one. She knew what this country asked of a person. She had paid what it asked and kept going. She stood in the doorway of the soddy and looked at the growing pit in the center of the floor. 2 feet deep by then, the clay coming up darker and harder with every inch. Ingrid's hands were wrapped in rags over blisters that had broken and bled and begun to harden into something tougher than what they had been before. "What are you building?" Sigrid asked. "A cellar, under the floor." Sigrid stepped inside. She studied the pit, the dimensions, the puncheon logs stacked against the wall. She was a woman who reached conclusions through observation rather than conversation, and she observed for a long time before she spoke. Root cellars are supposed to be separate from the house, she said. Otherwise, the damp gets into everything. I know. So why build one here, Ingrid explained. The root cellar she had visited, the warmth underground, the dry wood near the vent pipe, the idea that a sealed cellar held moisture, but a ventilated one moved air, and moving air carried moisture away, and if warm air from the stove could be channeled down through gaps in the floor, it would be warmer than the cellar air. And warm air holds moisture, so it would pick up the moisture from wet wood and carry it out through a vent on the other side. She was not building a root cellar. She was building a drying room. Sigrid listened to all of this without expression. When Ingrid finished, she crouched down and touched the earth wall of the pit still damp from excavation. My root cellar is wet, she said. Everyone's is. My carrots rot if I don't keep the door cracked and fall. Not sealed, Ingrid said. Ventilated. 2 openings. Air moves between them. It can't stay still long enough to stay damp. You've seen this work? No. Someone told you about it? No. Sigrid looked at her, not unkindly, but with the directness of a woman who has no patience left for softening things. You're betting everything on a guess. I'm betting everything on the only thing I can afford to build. Ingrid set down the bucket she'd been holding. I cannot build a woodshed. No lumber, no money, no time. But I can dig a hole. It costs nothing but work, and I have work. If I'm wrong, I'll have half the wood I need and none of it dry. I know what that means. Sigrid looked at Willem playing in the corner with a wooden spoon and an empty tin making the small, private sounds of a child absorbed in a world only he could see. Then she looked at Ingrid. You're either very clever or very stupid, she said. I genuinely cannot tell which. Neither can I, Ingrid said. Sigrid left. She did not offer to help. She did not tell Ingrid to stop. She walked to the door, stepped through it, and paused for just a moment before continuing a pause so brief that a person not paying close attention might have missed it. A pause that might have been nothing, or might have been a woman deciding something she was not yet ready to say aloud. Ingrid picked up her pick. She went back to work. The dirt pile outside grew. The pit deepened. October came with frost on the grass in the mornings, and ice in the water bucket, and geese moving south in long, ragged formations that seemed to be fleeing something specific. 3 feet down, 4 feet. The clay got harder, and she had to soak it overnight, bucket after bucket of water poured into the pit and left to soften the earth, then attack it again in the morning with the pick while it was still workable. 40 pounds of wet clay per bucket, hundreds of buckets per foot of depth. Her hands cracked and bled and healed and cracked again. The blisters became calluses, and the calluses split, and she wrapped her palms in strips of her oldest apron and kept swinging. By the end of the first week, she could not close her hands completely in the morning. She had to flex them for 10 minutes before they would grip the pick handle. Willem helped where a 5-year-old could help. He dragged the lighter buckets to the door. He fetched water. He sat quietly when she needed silence and chattered when she needed to hear a voice in the room. He did not ask again what she was doing. Perhaps he understood by then, in the way that small children sometimes understand the essential shape of a thing without understanding its reasons. She did not tell him what would happen if this didn't work. She did not let herself think about it either. Thinking about it cost time and energy she did not have. She thought instead about the next bucket, the next swing of the pick, the next foot of depth. One thing at a time, that was all, that was enough. The prairie wind came down at night and pressed against the sod walls, and inside the pit grew deeper, and the pile outside grew larger, and somewhere in the dark below the frost line, the earth held its steady patient 50 degrees waiting for Ingrid Solberg to finish what she had started and find out if the ground had something left to give. Cresswell Holt came on the 15th of October. Ingrid heard his horse before she saw him. She was 4 feet down in the pit, swinging the picket in the particular rhythm she had developed over 3 weeks. Not the rhythm of someone who had grown up doing this kind of work, but the rhythm of someone who had learned through repetition. What angle of swing broke the most clay with the least wasted motion? She had been wrong about the angle for the first 4 days. She had corrected it on the 5th. She had not wasted a swing since. She climbed out of the pit when she heard the horse, not because she felt she needed to present herself to whoever was coming, but because she had learned that it was better to be standing at ground level when people arrived than to be visible only from the shoulders up, standing in a hole in the middle of her floor. The hole tended to prompt conversations she did not always have the energy for. Cresswell Holt was 46 years old, broad through the chest, with the particular self-possession of a man who has never had serious cause to doubt his own judgment. He farmed a half-section, a half-mile north good land, with a gentle slope and reliable drainage, the kind of claim that rewarded the person who held it. He had been watching the Solberg claim since Petter Linfield had first gotten sick. He had been watching it the way a man watches something he expects to become available. He did not dismount. He sat on his horse and looked at the mound of excavated earth piled beside the soddy, a substantial mound by now taller than Willem, spreading in a wide arc from the doorway, and he looked at Ingrid's hands, which were wrapped in strips of cloth that had once been white and were no longer anything close to white, and he looked at her face, which told him nothing useful because she had trained it not to. "What are you building?" he said. "A cellar." He looked at the mound again, looked at the soddy door, looked back at her with the expression of a man working through a calculation. "Under your floor." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Building a grave." Ingrid did not answer this. She went to the doorway and picked up the empty bucket she had left there and went back inside to the pit. She could hear him dismounting behind her. She heard his boots on the packed earth as he followed her to the doorway and looked in. The pit was 4 feet deep now, 6 feet wide, 8 feet long. The walls were clay, shored up in 2 corners with cottonwood poles she had notched and braced diagonally the way she had seen done in illustrated farm manuals she had read in Minnesota years ago. The ramp at the near end, packed earth sloped at an angle she had calculated would let her drag a log down, without it rolling, was nearly finished. The trapdoor opening in the puncheon floor above it was framed and waiting for the hinges she had cut from old leather. Holt studied it for a long moment. "The land office has regulations," he said. "Improvements have to be genuine, substantial. A hole in the ground under your floor, that's not a standard improvement. That's not what the statute means." "It's a cellar," Ingrid said. "Cellars are improvements. A cellar under your living floor. That's not how it's done. Nobody does it that way." He paused. "The land office might look at something like this and decide you don't know what you're doing. Might decide the claim isn't being developed in good faith." Ingrid set the empty bucket in the pit and picked up the full one. She straightened and looked at him directly for the first time since he had come inside. "Then I suppose they'll come and tell me so." Holt shifted his weight. He was a man who was accustomed to conversations moving in the direction he pointed them, and this one was not. "I'll make you a fair offer," he said. "Better than fair. $50 for the claim. Transportation back to DeSmet. That's more than the land's worth unimproved, and it's certainly more than you'll get from anyone else." "It's improved," Ingrid said. "I'm improving it now." "You're digging a hole." She carried the bucket to the ramp, walked up. It continued to the door, dumped the clay onto the pile outside. She came back. Holt was still in the doorway. "You've got 3 cords of wood sitting outside getting wet," he said, "and 6 weeks until the first serious freeze. You're not going to make it. I have watched settlers come out here thinking they can do things differently, thinking they know better than the people who have already been through it. They don't make it. The ones who survive are the ones who follow proven methods." Ingrid went back down into the pit. She picked up the pick. "I've seen this before," Holt continued. "It always ends the same way." "Then you'll know what to expect," she said. She swung the pick. The crack of iron on the clay was loud in the small space, and Holt said nothing more over it. She swung again. She heard him shift in the doorway, heard him take a breath as though he was going to say something further, heard him decide not to. "When you're ready to sell," he said, "remember I offered fair price." His boots moved on the packed earth floor. She heard him mount his horse outside. She heard the horse move away at a walk, not a trot, the pace of a man who is leaving, without hurrying, because he believes he will be back on his own terms soon enough. Ingrid kept swinging. She did not stop to watch him go. She did not allow herself the small satisfaction of watching him go, because satisfaction cost seconds, and seconds were not hers to spend. The clay cracked. She shoveled it into the bucket. She kept working. The pit was finished on the last day of October. 5 feet deep, 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, 240 cubic feet of earth removed. She had calculated it afterward, lying on her cot in the dark after Willem was asleep. running the numbers the way she had begun running all numbers, not out of pleasure in the arithmetic, but because understanding the size of what she had done helped her understand the size of what remained. 12 tons of dirt, moved by hand, bucket by bucket, over the course of 2.5 weeks. Her body understood this in ways that numbers did not fully capture. The tendons in her forearms had swollen in the second week and stayed swollen. She had begun each morning for the past 10 days with a specific ritual. Sit on the edge of the cot place, both hands flat on her knees, and spend the first 10 minutes of consciousness slowly flexing and extending her fingers until they would close fully around an object. Until then, she could not grip the pick handle. Until then, she could not begin. She had not told Willem about this. He was 5 years old. He did not need to know. Now the finishing work remained, which was different from the digging, more careful, more deliberate, requiring thought rather than simply endurance. She lined the walls with salvaged boards. They came from her Uncle Peter's collapsed privy, which she had disassembled and stacked and now put to use. The boards were weathered and thin, but they were wood, and they kept the clay walls from crumbling inward, and they gave her something to push against when she needed to brace a pole. The corner supports were cottonwood, the same wood she had been hauling from Redstone Creek, notched and set diagonally because diagonal bracing resists pressure from multiple directions, and she had understood this instinctively before she had the words for why it was true. The ramp she compacted until it was solid enough to stand on without shifting, angled at exactly the slope she needed. The trap door she finished last. 3 feet by 2 feet cut into the puncheon floor and hinged with leather straps from an old bridle she had found in the collapsed barn. It opened smoothly, laid flat when closed so that a person walking across the floor would not catch a foot on it, and latched from above with a simple wooden peg. Then the ventilation. This was the heart of it. This was the thing that made it different from every other root cellar in Kingsbury County. This was the idea that had come to her in the dark in her dead uncle's cellar, standing with her hand on dry wood in a room that should have had no dry wood in it. She cut 3 gaps between the puncheon floorboards near where the stove would sit. Each gap was half an inch wide enough for air to move through, narrow enough that a person would not catch a heel. These were the inlet. Warm air from the cabin, heated by the stove above, would be denser than the cold air in the cellar and would descend through these gaps by convection. On the opposite wall near the cellar floor, she installed a length of salvaged stovepipe that Petter had kept for repairs. She cut a hole through the sod wall at ground level, angled the pipe upward through it so that it exited outside above the snow line, and sealed the gap around it with packed clay. This was the outlet. Cold air drawn in from outside through the pipe would enter at the bottom of the cellar, move across the floor, where the wood was stacked, pick up moisture from the green cottonwood logs, warm as it mixed with the descending cabin air, and rise. Rising, it would find the gaps in the floor above and exit into the cabin, where it would be warmed further by the stove, and the cycle would begin again. Continuous circulation. Continuous drying. That was the theory. She did not know if it would work. She had never seen it done. She had never spoken to anyone who had seen it done. She had built it from an observation and a memory and a long night of thinking in the dark, and now there was nothing left to do but fill it with wood and wait and find out. The wood came in slowly. Without the borrowed horse, she had only the handcart, a salvaged wagon box on 2 wheels that Peter had kept for hauling small loads around the claim. She could fit perhaps a quarter cord in it if she stacked the logs carefully and secured them with rope. 8 miles to Redstone Creek, 8 miles back. A full day for a quarter cord. She made the first trip on the 2nd of November. The trail was passable, the ground frozen hard enough to make the cart easier to pull than it would have been in mud, the cottonwoods along the creek still accessible, though the creek itself had begun to skin over with ice at the edges in the mornings. She cut and trimmed for 2 hours. She loaded the cart. She pulled it home. She arrived after dark. Willem had stayed with Sigrid Voss on hauling days. This was the arrangement that had revealed itself as necessary without being discussed. Ingrid could not bring a 5-year-old on a 16-mile round trip in November, and she could not leave him alone in the Sade, and Sigrid lived a quarter-mile south and had said, when Ingrid had stood at her door and explained the situation with the specific economy of a woman asking for something she would rather not need to ask for, that she was happy for the company for her own children. She had not charged for this. She had also not said anything about the cellar. Ingrid had not missed the absence of these words. She made the trip again on the 4th, again on the 7th, again on the 9th when the trail was harder and the wind from the northwest had shifted to something with an edge in it that got into the gaps in her coat and stayed there for the full 8 miles back. By mid-November, she had a quart and a half in the cellar. Cottonwood logs, green and heavy with moisture, stacked on the earthen floor in the 50-degree darkness below, the soddy floor in the warm circulating air that she had designed to pull the water out of them. Whether it was working, she could not yet tell. The wood looked the same. It smelled the same, the particular green smell of fresh-cut cottonwood, faintly sweet, carrying the moisture of the living tree it had recently been part of. She kept hauling. Sigrid Voss came on a morning in the 3rd week of November. She did not knock. She opened the soddy door and stepped inside in the manner of a woman who has decided something and is implementing the decision before she has time to reconsider it. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the trap door in the floor and then at Ingrid, who was at the stove making porridge. "I'm going to the creek tomorrow," Sigrid said, "miking my cart to get wood for myself. I need someone to watch my children while I'm gone." Ingrid turned from the stove. "I can do that." "Good." Sigrid's voice was level and practical. "And when I come back, I'll bring a load for you too. Call it payment for watching the children." Ingrid looked at her. "That's not equal payment. It's a trade. You watch my children. I haul your wood. It happens that I can bring more than I need for myself. It happens that you need it more than I do at present." "Sigrid." "I'm making a deal," Sigrid said, and her voice had the particular quality of a woman who has finished deliberating and is not interested in reopening the question. "You watch my children. I haul your wood. Take it or don't." Ingrid wanted to refuse. The refusal rose in her the way it rises in people who have learned to manage alone, not as pride exactly, but as something adjacent to pride, a deep structural resistance to being the person who receives rather than the person who gives. She had been the person who gave for 40 years. She did not know how to be the other one. But Willem was asleep on his blankets in the corner. 5 years old, 60 degrees in the Saudi at night, when the fire burned well and colder than that when it didn't, and the cellar not yet full, and the winter not yet serious, and the serious winter coming. "Take it," she said. Sigrid nodded once. "Have my children ready by dawn." She turned and walked out. That night, Ingrid lay awake for a long time listening to the wind and to Willem breathing and thinking about what it meant to need something from another person. Not the shame of it. She had moved past shame sometime in the 2nd week of digging when her hands were bleeding and the pit was only 3 feet deep and shame was a luxury she could not afford. But the weight of it, the specific weight of knowing that you are held up partly by something outside yourself and the responsibility that comes with that to not waste what you have been given, to make the thing they helped you build worth the helping. She would not waste it. November 25th, Sigrid came back from the creek with a half cord for Ingrid, in addition to her own load. The 28th, she went again and brought back a third of a cord. The trails were worsening, ice on the lower sections, ruts frozen hard and uneven hard on the cartwheels. Ingrid made her own trips on the days between. December 5th, first snow 2 inches that melted by noon, and came back harder that night 4 inches by morning. She made the trip anyway, came back with a quarter cord. The next morning her feet were swollen from the cold, and she could not get her boots on. She hauled water in her stockings, limping teeth set. She did not stop. On the 15th of December, the cellar held 4 cords. Still short of 6. Still short of what Arvid had said was the minimum. But Ingrid went down through the trap door that morning, not to add wood, but to take some away. She went to the far end of the cellar where the first logs she had stored, the ones she had carried down in late October, sat at the bottom of the stack. She pulled one out. It was a cottonwood log, 18 inches long, 4 inches in diameter. She had put it down there 6 weeks ago, green and heavy, with the moisture of a recently living tree. She knocked on it with her knuckle. The sound it made was hollow. Not the dull thud of wet wood which absorbs the impact and deadens it. A hollow sound, a dry sound. She turned it in her hands. The bark was cracking. Not rotting cracking the way bark cracks when the wood beneath it contracts as moisture leaves, when the material is becoming something drier and denser and more useful than what it had been. She could see along one split in the bark the pale interior wood, and It looked different from green cottonwood. It looked like wood that was ready to burn. She weighed it in her hands. Lighter. Noticeably measurably lighter than a log of the same size would have been in October. The moisture was gone from it. The warm, circulating air in the cellar had done what she had hoped it would do, had moved through the stacked wood, had held the moisture it pulled from the logs, had carried it upward, through the gaps in the floor, and out had been replaced by drier air from outside, and over 6 weeks had slowly, steadily transformed wet cottonwood into something approaching seasoned firewood. She went to the thermometer she had hung on the cellar wall, a kitchen thermometer that Sigrid had loaned her in November. 48 degrees. She went to the door and opened it. Outside air 12 below zero. The world above the ground was frozen in ways that a thermometer could barely measure. The prairie grass was locked in ice. The water in the bucket by the door had frozen solid by 8 in the evening for the past week. And 6 feet below that world in the earth that held its temperature, the way it had always held it, in the air that moved through her cellar, because she had given it 2 openings to move between the logs she had dragged 8 miles and stacked in the dark, were 48 degrees and drying still. She sat on the bottom rung of the ramp for a moment. Just a moment. She allowed herself this much. The theory had not been a guess. That was what she understood now, sitting in the warm dark of the cellar she had dug with hands that still ached in the mornings. It had been an observation about what moving air does and what still air does, about what the ground holds and what it gives back, about what happens when you stop trying to solve a problem the way everyone expects and start looking at what the problem is actually made of. She climbed back up through the trapdoor. She put the dry log in the stove and lit it and watched it catch, clean and fast, burning the way dry wood burns, without the sputtering and smoking of green wood, without the creosote it would have deposited in the stovepipe if she had burned it wet. Clean heat, honest heat, the kind that would keep a child alive through a Dakota winter. Arvid Breckman came the day before Christmas. He did not come inside. He stood in the yard in the gray afternoon light, looking at the sky to the northwest, with the expression of a man reading something he has read many times and does not like. Ingrid came out to him. "Storm coming," he said, not a greeting, just information he thought she needed. "How bad, bad?" He kept looking at the sky. "Maybe the worst in years. I can't say certain, but the signs are the same as 81. He turned briefly to look at her. "You remember what I said about 81 October to May? 35 blizzards." "I remember." "This warm spell." He gestured at the air around them, which was strangely mild for late December. In Dakota, 40 degrees that afternoon, the snow soft on the ground, the kind of day that could trick a person into thinking winter was easing when it was not easing at all. Warm spells come before the big ones. The cold builds up out on the plains, and the warm air comes down from the mountains first, and then the cold hits behind it, and when it hits hard. He paused. 1881 was like this. Warm for a week. Then it didn't stop for months. Ingrid looked at the sky. She could see what he was looking at now. A darkness on the northwestern horizon that was not weather exactly, but was the quality of the air, where weather was building a particular heaviness at the edge of the visible world. "The cellar," Arvid said. "The one you've been building. How much have you filled it?" 4.5 cords, she said. "I made one more trip yesterday in the good weather." He was quiet. She watched him process this. 4.5 cords against the 6 he had said she needed. Short, still short. But she watched him think about where she had been in October, and she watched him think about what it meant that she was at 4.5 cords in late December, and she watched something shift in his expression that was not quite what she would have called respect, not yet, but was perhaps the beginning of a recalculation. "The wood," he said, "is it drying?" "The wood I stored in October is dry," she said. "The November wood is getting there." He looked at the soddy, looked at the trap door she had left open in the floor, the dark rectangle visible from the yard. He looked at it for a long moment in the way that a man looks at something he cannot yet entirely account for. Then he pulled his coat tighter. "Keep that stove burning," he said. "Whatever happens in the next 2 weeks, whatever you run short of or run out of, keep the fire lit. As long as the fire is burning, you have a chance." He turned and walked back across the frozen prairie toward his own claim. She watched him go. The gray afternoon light was thickening to the northwest, and the strange warm air moved around her, with the particular falseness of warmth that is borrowed from somewhere and will be repaid at interest. She went inside. She went down through the trap door and brought up 6 logs, dry ones, from the October stack and piled them beside the stove. She checked the gaps in the floor. Still clear. Still moving air. She could feel it if she held her hand flat over them, the faint warm breath rising from below, carrying its invisible cargo of moisture up and out. She made supper, corn porridge again with a piece of salt pork that was nearly the last of what she had. Willem ate with the focused attention he brought to food, not talking, occasionally looking up at her across the small table with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of contentment. She did not tell him what Arvid had said about the storm. She did not tell him that she was short by 1.25 of the minimum that a man with 11 Dakota winters in him had said they needed. She tucked him in after supper. She sat beside the stove and fed it steadily, not letting the fire die down, watching the flames in the gap where the stove door didn't quite close all the way, listening to the wind begin to shift outside. From the west now, then the northwest. She added another log. The cellar below her feet held 4.5 cords of wood in 50-degree air, drying, still waiting in the dark below the frost line that could not reach it, patient as the earth that held it. She did not know if it would be enough. She knew she had done everything she could. The wind picked up through the night. By morning, January 11th, the strange warmth had given way to something different. The air was sharper, carrying a new quality in it. The quality that people who live long enough on the open plains learn to recognize, not by temperature or wind speed, but by what it does to the back of the throat when you breathe it. Something was coming. She spent the morning bringing up dry logs and stacking them inside the soddy within arm's reach of the stove, more than she would normally keep inside. Enough for 3 days, 4 if she was careful, stacked against the east wall where there was room. She did not ask herself why she was doing this. She just did it. By noon, the sky to the northwest had stopped being sky. The wall hit at 2:14 in the afternoon. Ingrid knew the exact time because she had been looking at the clock on the shelf above the stove when she heard Arvid's horse on the road, and the clock read 2:12 when she went to the door, and by 2:14, the world outside the soddy had ceased to exist. That is the only accurate way to describe it. Not that visibility dropped. Not that the storm arrived. The world outside ceased to exist. One moment there was a yard, a woodpile, a frozen prairie stretching to a horizon that had been carrying its dark weight all morning. The next moment there was nothing. A white darkness that was somehow both blinding and opaque, a pressure against every surface of the soddy, simultaneously a sound that was not wind, in any recognizable sense, but something more like the sound a world makes when it is being rearranged by a force that does not negotiate. The temperature dropped 3 degrees inside the soddy in the first 60 seconds. Ingrid felt it on her face. She was standing in the center of the room with Willem pressed against her side, and she felt the cold find the gaps in the sod walls. Gaps she had stuffed with rags in November. Gaps she had thought were sealed and pushed through them, the way cold always finds its way through what people think will hold it. She went to the stove. She did not run. Running served nothing. She walked to the stove and opened the firebox and laid in 2 logs from the stack she had built against the east wall that morning, the dry logs from the October cellar, the ones that had been in the 50-degree dark for 10 weeks and had given up their moisture to the moving air and emerged as something harder and more useful than what they had been. They caught immediately, clean and fast the way dry wood catches, the flame finding the grain and following it without the sputtering and smoking and reluctance of green wood. The firebox brightened. The heat came off the iron in waves. She fed it a 3rd log. Willem had not spoken since they came inside. He stood near the table watching her with the particular stillness of a 5-year-old who understands that this is a moment for stillness. He had not cried. He had not asked questions. He stood and watched and waited to understand from her face and her movements what he was supposed to feel. She looked at him and she kept her face deliberate. "Come sit by the stove," she said. He came and sat on the small stool she kept beside it, and she tucked the quilt her mother had made around his shoulders, and he held it closed with both hands and looked at the fire through the gap in the firebox door. Outside, the storm said what it had to say. It said it without pause and without modulation, a continuous physical fact pressing against the sod walls from every direction at once. She could feel it through the floor. She could feel it in the subtle shuddering of the poles that held the roof, the low creak of the structure, finding the limits of what it was willing to endure, and then holding there. The soddy held, sod walls 2 feet thick cut from the same prairie that was now being stripped by 60-mile-an-hour wind above the snow line, held the storm at the distance of 2 feet of compacted earth and grass root. The temperature inside dropped another degree, then stabilized. The stove had found its pace. The first night was the worst. Not because anything failed, because nothing failed, and Ingrid sat awake through the hours after Willem fell asleep and listened to a storm she could not see or measure or reason with, and the listening required a particular quality of alertness. Not fear exactly, but its functional cousin, the state of attention that keeps a person ready to act without burning through the energy that action will require. She fed the stove every 2 hours. She had done this calculation before she slept, how long a log burned at this size of fire, how often she needed to add wood to keep the temperature inside the soddy from dropping below what Willem's sleeping body needed, what the margin was between adequate and dangerous. She had made this calculation in October during the first cold weeks, and she had refined it in November and December, and she knew it now, the way she knew the flex routine for her swollen hands, not as arithmetic, but as physical knowledge embedded in her body by repetition. She set the clock, and she slept in 2-hour intervals. Each time the clock woke her, she was already sitting up before the alarm finished. Already oriented, already knowing where the logs were, and where the stove was, and what the temperature felt like in the air against her face. She added wood. She checked the floor gaps, pressing her hand flat over the half-inch openings near the stove, feeling for the faint warm breath that meant the cellar air was still moving, still circulating, still doing its work in the dark below. The breath was there each time, steady, patient, unhurried. She checked Willem, sleeping, his breath visible in the cold air away from the stove, becoming invisible close to it, his face relaxed in the specific way of children who are warm enough to sleep deeply and do not know yet what is happening outside. She went back to her cot. 2 more hours. The storm did not stop on the first day. It did not stop on the second. Dakota blizzards do not stop when people need them to. They stop when they are finished, and this one was not finished. The second day, Willem woke to the sound of the storm and lay still for a moment listening to it before he asked his first question. "Is it still there?" "Still there," Ingrid said. He thought about this. "Is it going to stop?" "Yes." "When?" "I don't know exactly, but it will stop. All storms stop." He seemed to find this acceptable. He sat up and wrapped himself in the quilt and looked at the stove and then at the floor around him. "It's warm," he said. Not a question. An observation delivered with the mild surprise of someone who expected something different and is revising his expectations. "Yes. It was cold last night. It was colder outside than inside. That's different." He looked at her with the expression he used when he was deciding whether a distinction was real or whether an adult was managing him. Then he nodded, apparently deciding it was real. "Why are we warm?" he asked. "Other people are cold." Mr. Breckman said people were cold in the big storms. Ingrid was at the stove making porridge from the last of the oats she had stored on the high shelf. She did not stop stirring. "Because we built something," she said. "The hole in the floor." "The cellar." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, working through this with the methodical thoroughness that was characteristic of him. "The hole keeps us warm. The cellar keeps the wood dry," she said. Dry wood burns better than wet wood. Better fire means more heat. More heat means we stay warm." She paused. "And the earth below us is warmer than the air above. The ground holds its heat. We put that to use." Willem looked down at the floor, at the trap door, its leather hinges flush with the puncheon boards. "We dug deep enough," he said. Ingrid set 2 bowls on the table. "Yes," she said. "We dug deep enough." They ate in the sound of the storm, which had not lessened. Outside the oiled paper window, the light that came through was white and directionless, the light of a world made entirely of moving snow. She could see nothing through it. The woodpile outside was buried. The trail to Sigrid Voss's claim was buried. The road to Arvid Breckman's was buried. The entire familiar geography of Kingsbury County had been replaced by a single undifferentiated whiteness that gave no information about direction or distance or what lay beyond it. The stove gave heat. The cellar gave dry wood. The earth gave its steady 50 degrees. They played the games that a 64-year-old woman and a 5-year-old boy can play in a 14-foot room with what is available: counting games, word games, stories that Ingrid made up from the materials of her own memory stories about Minnesota and about Gunnar and about Willem's mother when she was small. She told him things she had not told him before because there had always been something else to do, and now there was nothing else to do. And the telling felt necessary, felt like a form of warmth that the stove could not provide. She told him about his mother learning to braid, about the way she had insisted on braiding everything in reach, including the dog's tail, until the boss and everyone else had established firm boundaries on the practice. Willem laughed at this with his whole body the way small children laugh when something strikes them as genuinely funny rather than merely amusing. Ingrid watched him laugh. She thought about the pit she had dug, about the 12 tons of earth she had moved one bucket at a time while the valley waited for her to give up, about the vent pipe and the floor gaps and the dry wood in the dark below, about Cresswell Holt on his horse telling her she was building a grave, about Arvid Breckman telling her they would dig her out of a snowdrift, about this child laughing warm in a soddy in the middle of the worst blizzard in memory. She fed the stove another log, dry, clean, burning straight and honest. The third morning the storm broke. Not gradually. In Dakota, the end of a blizzard can be as sudden as its beginning. The pressure lifts. The wind drops from 60 miles an hour to nothing. In the course of an hour, the sky clears from the west, and the cold that follows is still severe. But it is a different kind of severe, the kind that has a temperature you can measure rather than a force that simply overwhelms. Ingrid heard the change before she could see it. The quality of the sound against the sod walls shifted: less pressure, more whistle, then less whistle, then only the sound of snow settling on itself as the wind stopped pushing it. She went to the door. She lifted the latch and pushed, and the door did not open because snow had drifted against it in the night. She pushed harder. The snow gave, slowly compacting, and she got the door open 12 inches and looked out. The world outside was white in a way that seemed to have no variation. The prairie was not flat anymore. It was sculpted, drifted the snow, having built itself into shapes that bore no relationship to the terrain beneath. The woodpile was buried completely. The trail to the road was gone. The sky above it all was the sharp, pale blue that follows Dakota blizzards, a blue so clear and cold, it seemed to exist at a different altitude than ordinary sky. The thermometer outside the door read 17 below, not the -40 that the storm had pushed it to during the worst of the second night. 17 below. Cold, genuinely cold, the kind of cold that requires care and respect. But 17 below is a number that a stove and dry wood can manage. 40 below is a number that asks questions about whether the stove and the wood are enough. She had enough. She went back inside. She went down through the trap door and looked at what remained in the cellar. A cord and a half, she estimated, perhaps a cord and 3/4 if she was being precise. The wood she had stored in October and November had dried fully over the 12 weeks it had sat in the moving air below the floor. The December wood was not fully seasoned, but it was drier than it had been, drier than green cottonwood had any right to be after 3 weeks in a Dakota winter. It was enough to finish the winter. She understood this with the same certainty that she understood the flex routine for her hands and the 2-hour intervals for the stove. It was enough. She had come in short of 6 cords, and she had still come through because the wood she had was worth more than green wood of the same volume, because the cellar had done what she had built it to do. She sat on the ramp in the warm dark for a moment. Then she climbed up. She learned what had happened in the valley over the following days as the trails were broken open, and people began moving again, and information traveled the way it always travels after a disaster in pieces. Each piece added to the picture until the whole thing became visible. The storm had arrived without meaningful warning across an enormous area of Dakota territory. The temperature drop had been as fast as anything anyone could measure: 40 degrees in less than 3 hours in some locations. People who had been outside at 2 o'clock were dead before 3 o'clock, caught in the open by a storm that moved faster than any winter storm had moved in living memory. The schoolhouses were the worst of it. Teachers across the territory had let children out at noon recess, or at the end of the school day, without knowing what was behind the warm morning. Children had started home across familiar prairie ground, and the storm had overtaken them before they could reach shelter. Some had survived by the particular luck of being close to a building or a haystack. Others had not. They called it the school children's blizzard. Ingrid heard this in Sigrid Voss's sadi 4 days after the storm broke, sitting at Sigrid's table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. That was the first coffee she had tasted since early December. Sigrid had come through. Her 2 children had come through. Her livestock had not fared as well, but livestock could be replaced. Sigrid told her about the families who had lost animals, about the Hendersons who had burned their furniture in the second night when the wood ran out, about the Palmgren claim where the family had survived by sheltering in the barn with the cattle and sharing their body heat with the animals that shared their body heat back. She did not ask Ingrid about the cellar. Not directly. She talked around it the way she had talked around everything since October, observationally from a slight distance, as though the subject were something she was approaching carefully rather than ignoring. Finally, Ingrid said, "The wood was dry. The cellar kept it dry." Sigrid looked at her cup. "I know," she said. "I could smell it. When I came past your place on the second morning to check, I stood outside and I could smell the smoke from your stovepipe. Clean smoke. Dry wood burns clean." She paused. "My wood smoked all 3 days. Green wood. I went through 5 cords to get the same heat you got from 3. She said this without inflection, as information, as a fact she had arrived at through her own observation and was now reporting. "The ventilation," Ingrid said. "That's the thing that matters. 2 openings. Air moves between them. It can't stay still long enough to stay damp." Sigrid nodded slowly. "I'd like to understand it better," she said, "if you were willing." "I'm willing," Ingrid said. Arvid Breckman came on the morning of January 16th, 4 days after the storm broke. The trail between his claim and hers had been broken open by then, the snow packed hard enough by cold and used to support a man's weight, and she heard his footsteps on it before she heard his knock. He knocked. He did not walk in the way that people who know each other well walk in. He knocked and waited, which told her something about the state of mind in which he had arrived. She opened the door. He stood on the step in his heavy coat, hat in hand, looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the assessing expression of August when he had walked the circuit of the sadi and done the arithmetic that predicted her death. Not the flat certainty of the morning he had told her about the storm and said to keep the fire lit. Something different. Something that a man who has been certain for 69 years wears when certainty has been revised. He looked past her into the sadi, at the stove burning steadily, at Willem sitting at the table drawing shapes on a piece of paper with a stub of charcoal, at the warmth that was visible in the way the air inside the door was different from the air outside it, not steaming, not dramatically warm, just the particular quality of a space that has been maintained at a livable temperature through 3 days of something that was not livable. He looked down, at the trapdoor flush with the puncheon floor, its leather hinges dark with use. He stood there for a long moment and said nothing. Ingrid waited. She had learned over the past 5 months that some things needed the time they needed, and that hurrying them cost more than waiting. "You still have wood," he said, not a question. She understood the distinction. He was not asking whether she had wood. He was stating in the particular voice of a man revising a conclusion he had held with confidence since August that she had wood. That the fact of it required acknowledgement in spoken form before anything else could happen. "1.5 cords," she said, "maybe closer to 2. He nodded, once, slowly. The man who had told her they would dig her and the boy out of a snowdrift. The man who had done the arithmetic in August and reached a conclusion that any reasonable person doing the same arithmetic would have reached. The man who had 11 Dakota winters behind him and had buried 4 neighbors and had believed with the authority of direct experience that what Ingrid Solberg was attempting was not survivable. Standing in her doorway, hat in his hand, looking at the floor. "The cellar," he said, "the one you built." A pause. "How did you build it?" Ingrid looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door and opened it wider. "Come in," she said. "I will show you." He came in. He sat at the table across from Willem, who looked at him with the frank, unguarded assessment of a 5-year-old, and then went back to his shapes. Ingrid poured 2 cups of the thin chicory coffee she had been making since the real coffee ran out in November, and set one in front of him. She opened the trap door. She showed him the ramp and the dimensions and the way the walls were lined. She showed him the gaps in the floor nearest to the stove, 3 of them, half an inch each, currently breathing their faint, warm exhalation upward into the cabin. She showed him the vent pipe through the sod wall. its exterior end well above the snow level, drawing air from outside into the cellar below. She explained the circulation, the warm air descending, the cold air entering at the bottom, the moisture being carried upward and out, the wood drying over weeks in the 50-degree dark below the frost line. He listened without interrupting. He asked two questions, both of them practical: the angle of the vent pipe and the spacing of the floor gaps. And she answered them precisely because she had thought about both carefully when she designed the system and knew the answers. He went down the ramp. He stood in the cellar for several minutes. She could hear him moving around below, his footsteps on the earthen floor, the sound of him touching the stacked wood, the faint creak of him crouching down to look at the vent pipe opening. She could hear him. She realized breathing the air down there, the still warm 50-degree air that smelled of wood and earth, and the particular smell of something that has been worked at for a long time by someone who did not stop. He came back up. He stood in the center of the soddy, and he looked at everything in it: the stove, the wood stack, the child at the table, the woman beside it, and he did not say what he had said in August. He did not do the arithmetic aloud. He did not offer advice about what she should have done differently or what she should do next. He said, "I have a neighbor north of me, Halverson. His woodshed burned in October. Chimney fire from green wood. He made it through the storm, but he's short in a way that won't last to March." Ingrid looked at him. "I can show him the cellar," she said. "If he wants to build one, I'll tell him what to do." Arvid nodded. He put his hat back on. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. He did not turn around. But he stood there for a moment with his hand on the latch, and Ingrid understood that there was something he wanted to say, and that saying it required the particular effort that honest things require from people who have been certain they were right. "You were right," he said, "about the cellar, about what it could do." He opened the door and went out. The cold air from outside moved briefly through the soddy, and then the door closed and the warmth settled again, and Willem did not look up from his shapes, and Ingrid stood in the center of the room she had made habitable by a method no one had suggested and everyone had doubted. She went to the stove and added a log. In the spring, when the trails opened and the valley began the work of assessing what the winter had taken and what it had left, Cresswell Holt did not come back. Not with a new offer, not with any offer, not with questions or commentary or the particular confidence of a man who has been waiting for someone else to fail. He did not come, and Ingrid did not go looking for him, and the silence between his absence and her presence was the only conversation they had in 1888. In April, a man from the land office came to assess improvements on the claim. He was a practical man, young, carrying a ledger and a measuring tape, and the brisk efficiency of someone with many claims to visit and limited time for each. He looked at the soddy, he looked at the leveled cook stove, and the repaired roof, and the winter's worth of evidence that the place had been lived in seriously and continuously. Then he saw the trap door. He opened it. He went down the ramp. He came back up. He wrote in his ledger for a while. Then he said, "This is a cellar." "It is," Ingrid said. "Under the floor, the living structure." "Yes," he wrote some more. "I haven't seen this configuration before," he said. "The vent pipe through the exterior wall. For air circulation," she said. "It dries the wood stored inside." He looked at what she had written in the notebook she had kept since October, the temperatures, the wood weights before and after drying, the dates, the amounts. He did not ask to read it closely, but she could see him noting the existence of it, noting the care of it, noting that this was not a person who had dug a hole in her floor on impulse, but a person who had designed something, tested it, and recorded the results. He closed his ledger. "This is a substantial improvement," he said. "The cellar represents significant labor investment in practical utility." A pause. "The claim is being developed in good faith." He left. The claim was hers. The following autumn, before the first frost, Ingrid drew 3 diagrams on pieces of paper she cut from the back pages of the ledger she had bought in De Smet the previous spring. The diagrams showed the cellar from 3 angles: top view, side view, cross-section, with the vent pipe and floor gaps marked and dimensioned and labeled in her careful handwriting. She gave one diagram to Sigrid Voss, who had come 3 times in the spring to ask questions, and each time had listened with the full attention of a person converting information directly into plans. She gave one to Arvid Breckman, who came himself to ask for it, which she noted and which cost him something she could see in the way he asked, and which she gave him without reference to that cost, because the cost was his to carry and not hers to observe aloud. She gave the third to the Halverson family north of the Breckman claim, whose woodshed fire the previous October had nearly killed them, and who were determined not to face another winter the same way. By the end of October 1888, 3 cellars in Kingsbury County were being built after the design of the one Ingrid had built under her floor the previous autumn. 2 of them were exact copies. One had been modified by its builder to accommodate a larger floor plan, and that modification worked, which meant the principle was sound enough to survive adaptation. She did not charge for the diagrams. She did not put her name on them, though Sigrid told her she should. People should know who figured it out, Sigrid said. People should know how to build it, Ingrid said. That's the part that matters. Sigrid looked at her for a moment with the expression she used when she disagreed but had decided not to argue. Both matter, she said. Ingrid folded another piece of paper and drew the top view again from memory, which she could do now as easily as she could write her own name. In the years that followed, Willem grew the way children grow in hard country, steadily, seriously, with a competence that came from having been needed early. He learned to haul wood and manage a stove, and read a Dakota sky for what it was planning. He learned to keep records the way his grandmother kept records, not out of affection for numbers, but out of understanding that numbers remember things you cannot afford to forget. When he was old enough to understand the winter of 1888 as a story rather than as a lived experience, he half remembered and half reconstructed from what he had been told. He asked Ingrid about it. Not once but many times in the way that people return to a story that contains something essential. He asked about the digging, about the 12 tons, about the hands that could not close in the mornings. He asked about Cresswell Holt and his offer of $50. He asked about Arvid Breckman at the door with his hat in his hands. He asked about the storm, about what it sounded like against the sod walls, and what it felt like to lie awake in 2-hour intervals, feeding a fire through 3 days of something that the rest of the valley remembered as the worst thing it had ever experienced. Ingrid answered all of these questions with the same directness she brought to everything. Not dramatically, not with the weight that some people add to stories in the telling, making them larger than they were. Just the facts of it in the order it happened with the details that mattered. The last question he asked, the one he came back to most often, was the simplest one. How did you know it would work? And Ingrid's answer was always the same. I didn't know, she said. I knew what I had seen. I knew what moving air does and what still air does. I knew the ground holds its heat. I knew the wood near the vent in Peter's cellar was dry when everything else was wet. She looked at him. I didn't know if it would work. I knew it was the only thing I could build with what I had. So I built it and I found out. He thought about this the way he thought about everything thoroughly from multiple angles, turning it over until it was fully examined. That's not the same as knowing, he said. No, she agreed. It's better than knowing. Knowing is something you have before you start. What I had was a reason to try. That's what got us through. The cellar lasted 12 years before the soddy above it was replaced by a proper timber house, built in stages as money became available, built in part by Willem's own hands when he was old enough for the work to be his rather than borrowed labor. When they dug the foundation for the timber house, they found the cellar intact. The vent pipe was still in place, still at its original angle, still functional. The floor gaps had been sealed years earlier when the puncheon floor was replaced, but the marks where they had been were visible in the new boarding. Willem stood in the old cellar one last time before it was filled. 48 degrees, even in summer, even 30 feet from a timber frame that had no special insulation, no design consideration for temperature. Just the earth holding what it held, the same temperature it had held since before the first settler ever broke the first acre of Dakota sod. He stood there for a few minutes. He was thinking about his grandmother, who was 76 years old by then, and moved slowly but still kept records, and still gave away diagrams to anyone who asked, and still when people came to her with problems they couldn't solve by conventional methods, asked the same question she had been asking since 1887. What does the problem actually look like when you stop assuming you know what it is? He climbed out. He went and sat with her on the step of the new house in the late afternoon sun, and they looked out at the valley together, at the prairie grass, at the creek line in the distance, at the sky that was the same sky it had always been, indifferent and enormous, and occasionally lethal, and occasionally in the right light at the right moment. simply beautiful in the way that large and honest things are beautiful. I filled the old cellar today, he said. Ingrid nodded. It did its job, she said. It did, he agreed. They sat for a while longer. The sun moved in the way it moves on autumn afternoons, amber and low casting long shadows across the grass. 64 years old, Willem said. 12 tons of dirt. By yourself. Not entirely by myself, Ingrid said. You dragged the lighter buckets. He smiled. She did not smile often enough that he had stopped noticing when she did. You dug deep enough, he said. She looked out at the valley. Yes, she said. We did. Ingrid Solberg had no credentials, no money, no one who believed she would survive the winter of 1887. She had a 5-year-old boy who needed her to find an answer, a pick that had belonged to a dead man, and the refusal to accept that the only solutions were the ones that had already been tried. She dug 12 tons of earth with her bare hands because she had looked at a piece of dry wood in a damp cellar and asked a question that no one else had thought to ask. She built something that had never been built before because she had nothing to lose by trying and everything to lose by not. The storm came. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 hours. The valley counted its dead. In a soddy at the edge of Kingsbury County, a fire burned clean and steady, fed by wood that was dry, because a woman had put it in the right place at the right time and built the right conditions around it. Sometimes the answer is not above you. Sometimes you have to dig down to find it. Sometimes the ground has been holding it for you all along, waiting for someone willing to go deep enough to ask.